Are you living a good life? I don't know how you even begin to answer that question. What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be good? What's our purpose? What's our destination? If we're going to learn what a good life is, we probably need to know why we're here. These are questions that are addressed in the passage that we're looking at today in Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 to 40. In these two passages, two very different sets of religious leaders, actually religious leaders who are enemies of each other, one group known as Sadducees and the other group known as Pharisees, bring a question of the day to Jesus. And they're questions that have got to do with eternal destination, what happens after we die, and questions to do with what is our purpose here in life, here and now. Important questions then, and important questions for us today. Jesus is not quite what these religious leaders were expecting from the Messiah. Christians came to believe that Jesus was the rescuer, the Christ, the one that the Old Testament promised would be God living on the earth, the Messiah. The religious leaders were not anticipating somebody like Jesus. They certainly weren't anticipating somebody who suggested to them that they had it all wrong, that if they didn't get their act together, they were going to find themselves outside the eternal party that God was inviting people to come into. They had questions and questions from their day that they wanted to bring to Jesus to test him. Essentially, they wanted to bring him down. So they bring these questions of the day to Jesus. Now, I don't know whether we've got questions of the day now. I think there probably are big questions and more trivial questions. Things like, will I be able to get a haircut anytime soon? Who's the fourth man? Who's the greatest of all time? Jordan or LeBron? What do you prefer? Pipers or Romeos? Call of Duty or Super Mario? We have all kinds of questions. Some of them are small and trivial and frivolous, and there are questions that are much bigger ones about who we are. These two groups of religious people bring big questions of the day to Jesus. And I want to make two general points about Jesus' answer first. And the first is this, and this might seem a little bit obvious, but I don't want you to take it for granted, that when these religious leaders bring something to Jesus, he has something to say. Very clear views on things that communicate that God has things to say on the issues of the day. Why you might take that or might ignore that or miss that or not see why it's significant is because lots of the spirituality of our day, the religious practice of our day, much of it that's based in Eastern thinking, really is quite vague on how things are. There's lots of talk of energy and the universe and tapping into the things around us, but very little that offers clear, substantial statement on the nature of things. It's very attractive to many because it allows the individual to kind of make their own choices. And on the surface of things, that's very, very helpful, or it seems very attractive. The truth lies within yourself. You'll find the truth if you just examine yourself and reflect and meditate on yourself. But for those who've done that and have looked inside themselves and have found inside themselves wanting, have found that there isn't an answer inside themselves, there's good news. And the good news is that Christianity comes and says, no, the answers aren't inside yourself. God is real and has character and has definitive things to say on the nature of things. Gathering truth is not like trying to fill a water bucket with uncooked spaghetti. There is something solid to be grasped, to meditate on with your heart and your mind. The good news is there is actual answers to questions. That's the first thing I want to say about Jesus' answer. The second thing is this, is that when Jesus answers, Jesus, who his followers came to believe was God himself, who could have spoken with the authority of heaven himself, when he answers, he uses the Bible to say what the truth about the nature of things is. So, for example, at verse 31, the Sadducees come to Jesus. Jesus answers the Sadducees and he says, have you not read? Read what? Well, read from the Bible. Verse 32 of Matthew chapter 22, he says, God says, quoting from the Bible, I am the God of Abraham. That's a quote from the Old Testament. And again, in verse 37, when he's answering the Pharisees' question, he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. That is a quote from Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. He goes on to say, love your neighbor as yourself. And again, that's from Leviticus 19 in the Old Testament. True, solid things about the nature of how the universe is, the nature of God and life, are to be found in the Bible. Now, of course, some of you, probably all of us, have encountered bits of the Bible and we've said to ourselves, is that really true? Why is that in there? Why has God said that thing? I don't understand it. And just like getting to know someone, sometimes with the Bible, you have to start with the basics, the primary things. And as you get to know those basics, as you get to understand God, the other bits fall into place and they become clearer. The power of the Bible in the life of a Christian is something to behold, and it's our reference point for understanding the truth. Somebody called Corrie ten Boom. She was the first woman ever to be licensed as a watchmaker in Holland. She was licensed in 1922 and worked as a watchmaker for a long time. When the Nazis invaded her country, nearly 2 decades later, she did something very extraordinary. She was a committed Christian. She knew that the Nazis were persecuting and killing Jewish people, and she and her family hid Jewish people and tried to save as many of them as they could. Somebody in her neighborhood shopped her in, was an informer to the Nazis, shopped her in, and she, her father, and her sister ended up in a Nazi concentration camp. Her sister and father died in that camp. Boom relates the importance of the Bible to helping her survive captivity. She says this. She says, I've experienced that's God's, presence in the deepest, darkest hell that men can create. I've tested the promises of the Bible, and believe me, you can count on them. I know, she says, that Jesus Christ can live in you, in me, through his Holy Spirit. You can talk with him. You can talk with him out louder in your heart when you're alone, as I was alone in solitary confinement. The joy is that he hears each word. God is a God who communicates. He communicates through the Bible, and he listens to us as we respond to it. There are things that God wants to communicate to you, substantial things, and they're there to be had in the Bible. So then, to the issues and the questions themselves that raise their heads in these two passages. First of all, we get the Sadducees. Okay, these are these religious leaders called the Sadducees. Something you should know about them. One of the distinctive beliefs that they have was that they didn't believe that there was any heaven after you died. According to a Jewish historian of the time, somebody called Josephus, he says of them, he says the doctrine of the Sadducees is this: souls die with bodies. There is nothing beyond the physical once you die. There is no life after death. And it's a common view held today. For example, Stephen Hawking has said there is no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That's how he understands humans, broken down computers. That is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. The Sadducees agree with what Hawking said all these years later. The Sadducees bring an example to Jesus, and this is part of their thinking or understanding of why there would be a heaven. They bring a strange kind of law or custom in Jewish practice, and what it said was, if there was a man who was married to a woman and that man died, the brother of that man was honor bound to marry the widow. They bring this example. It's kind of a kind of absurd example of a woman and a man, like 7 brothers, and one of them dies, and she ends up being married to all of them because of this custom. And they say, well, which person is married to the woman in heaven? Essentially what they're saying is that's such a complicated question to work out. There can't be a heaven. Now, as I said, it seems a little bit absurd, but let me tell you, I've heard a fairly prominent atheistic scientist make a claim almost exactly the same to say why he doesn't believe in the afterlife. There's a man called Bill Nye. He's from the TV show Bill Nye, the Science Guy, which was a popular science show in the 90s. He doesn't believe in God and doesn't believe in afterlife. He says this. One of the reasons he doesn't believe is because he says there doesn't seem to be any reason to think that when you die, you go back to your optimum age, at your optimum athletic ability, in your optimum intellectual sharpness. Essentially, he says there can't be an afterlife because it's too difficult to work out which kind of body we're going to have, what version of us is going to appear in heaven. Now, Jesus handles the Sadducees' question with his knowledge of the nature of relationships in heaven. He simply says at the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. Marriage is something for this earth, as we have it now, but it doesn't exist in heaven. That clears up this absurd issue of which man, this woman, which one of the brothers she's going to be married to. By the way, Paul clears up Bill Nye's question about which version of our bodies we're going to have in heaven in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But that's your homework. If you want to find out the answer to that, you can look it up. Jesus says there is a heaven. He takes the Sadducees to a part of the Bible they took to be from God. The Sadducees didn't believe all of the Old Testament, just the first 5 books known as the Pentateuch. He takes them to Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and chapter 3. And he does this at verse 32 in Matthew. And in that bit of Exodus, Moses is confronted by God, and God speaks to him from a burning bush, and it's an extraordinary encounter. And there God reveals himself to Moses, saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And why does Jesus quote this? Well, the point he's making is that God told Moses that he was the God of, 3 dead men. It's not very impressive for God to come and say he's the God of dead people who no longer are. It's like living in your past glories. Jurgen Klopp should sign me up for Liverpool because I can tell him that somewhere around 1990 I scored a goal from the halfway line playing against Portmarnock FC. Maybe I should be at the Olympics. I'd like to be at the Olympics in Tokyo 2020 or 2021 because in the under 13 school championships I have a silver medal in badminton. Send me to Tokyo. No, living on past glories is no use for now. God is telling Moses that he's the God of 3 men who are resurrected, men who he's still the God of. Sadducees, says Jesus, God is the God of the living, not the dead. He's the God of the living Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Heaven is real. And we see this in the Bible talked about again and again and again. Isaiah 25, for example. Isaiah says, He, God, will swallow up death forever. There is a better place coming. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. Revelation 21 takes up that theme. This is the last book of the Bible. It says, He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Maybe you're so frustrated with this life. Maybe you're thinking, is there any hope beyond this? There's hope in this life, but is there hope after it? And the Bible says yes, that for those who believe in Jesus, heaven is real. There is a place, as wonderful as it sounds, as maybe optimistic as it sounds, wishful thinking according to Stephen Hawking. It is real. Heaven is there. It is possible because God has made it so. So we don't need to fear death. We don't need to fear death as the end. As Paul writes, where, O death, is your victory? Jesus has defeated death. And heaven is possible for those who follow him. That's the question about our destination. What we were made for eternally. What were we made to do? To be with God forever. Now a question about our purpose in this life. A question that really gets to the heart of that question I asked at the beginning. How are you getting on in your life? Are you living a good life? The Pharisees and the Sadducees were kind of enemies of each other. And think about people who are enemies of each other. A terrible thing is about to happen. It looks like Manchester United are going to make it to the final of the Europa League. If you don't understand what that means, don't worry. Now, you may not know this about me, but I'm a Liverpool fan. I'm a little bit reluctant and shy to tell you a bit things about myself in that area. There's a high degree of likelihood that Liverpool fans are going to find themselves cheering for Manchester United that night they get to the Europa League final. If Liverpool finish 5th in the league, outside the all-important Champions League spots normally, they will enter the Champions League, which is massive for them, if Man United win the Europa League. For one night only, you're going to see a very unusual sight. And it is going to be, should these things come to pass, that Liverpool fans cheer for Manchester United. Well, the Pharisees are in a funny sort of Liverpool fan-like position here. Their biggest enemies, the Sadducees, are being given the runaround by Jesus, who they don't like at all either. But they're enjoying that the Sadducees are being kind of beaten by Jesus. Who doesn't want to see your greatest enemy being beaten? Verse 34, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. The Sadducees have been defeated. What if we can show Jesus up? Then we're going to show ourselves to be better than the Sadducees. Our enemies are beaten. If we can finish Jesus off, we can really think of ourselves as something. They take up an issue and they take it to Jesus, an issue of the day. And the issue is to do with what is the greatest commandment in the law. There are 10 commandments, and the Pharisees, like to argue over which one is the best or the most important. And so they asked Jesus that question, which is the most important. And instead of answering with any of the 10 commandments, Jesus quotes a different part of the Bible, not the one where the commandments are, answering at verse 37, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. That was a phrase that was taken from the Bible that was part of a prayer that was known to the Jewish people as the Shema. And that was a prayer that the Jewish people said every day, twice a day. And the beginning of it was this bit from the Bible that talked about loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind. You see, the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus. They're trying to get him to prefer one commandment over the other so that they could say that he was weak and disobedient on some things. So instead of picking any of them, he picks 2 bits from the Bible that sum up the entire law. The other bit is love God and love your neighbor as yourself, is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's the other side of it. Look at the contrast between Jesus and the Pharisees. The religious leaders want to pick out commandments that are the most important so that they can show themselves to look holy. You see, if you never steal and you can convince people that not stealing is the most important commandment, you can make it look like you're the holiest of all. They see religion as a kind of a checklist, the things that you've got to do to measure up that God is looking at. And if you can just achieve these things, you can say, I'm a holy person, I'm right with God. And believe me, they did that. They did that for themselves, but they did it even more for other people. They looked at other people and they had a checklist for them and essentially said, no, you're not right before God. Well, there's both good news and bad news in Jesus' response. And I'll start with the bad. Jesus says this. He's saying, here's how you're supposed to live. Love the Lord your God with everything you have. What's your goal in life? It's to live wholeheartedly and totally with love for God and to love people as if they were yourself. It's an all-consuming, life-consuming activity and purpose. There is no checklist when you can tick off and say, okay, it's done. If your religion amounts to being a checklist where you say, yep, I do that, or I don't do that, or I've done that little bit of religion, now I can get on with my life, there's bad news for you. Because Jesus says that what it is to be faithful, what it is to be alive, what it is to relate to God, is to have this life that is lived before God wholeheartedly with every bit of who you are. Now, the good news, though, on the other hand, is that at the heart of your existence as a person, the very core of who you are, what you were made for by God, is to relate. Life is about love, not law. No one wants to be in a relationship where they're only accepted if their performance is up to scratch. And what Jesus says is what's most important is relationships with God and relationships with each other. To love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Imagine people went around living like this. There would be no need for the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter. Because every man would realize that women probably don't want to be treated as sexual objects if they thought like this. And you'd be acutely aware that to be mistreated because of the color of your skin is soul destroying if you lived like this. It is a radical way of living. We're not turned in on ourselves, but we look up to God and we love our neighbor. What do you want most for yourself? What do you want most for those who you care about? Let me give you an example from parenting of this. Go to the parent-teacher meeting. I was at my first parent-teacher meeting. I wasn't at one last year, and then Victoria and I were both able to go to one on Zoom. And it's so tempting when you go to a parent-teacher meeting to follow, in a sense, the way of the world, and to think the thing that matters most in your child's life is successes and achievements. To want them to prioritize and to say that the most important thing is for them to be good at stuff, whether it's reading or writing, or whether it's good at sports, or whether it's to know history. So tempting to think that that is what it is to be a parent, to get your kids to be good at stuff. And of course, you've got to educate them. And of course, you've got to care about those things. But you don't prioritize it at all. No, in the parent-teacher meeting, maybe what you're looking out for, maybe what you should be looking out for is character, not successes. Hints from what you hear that suggest that your child is living like God wants them to live. About their character, specifically their Christ-like character. Does my child have the fruit of the Spirit? Are they kind? Are they gentle? Are they displaying patience? Your job is not to teach your children to be happy or successful. It's impossible. It's to teach them to love God and to love their neighbor. What they and what you are invited to by God is a relationship of a loving father and child, not a taskmaster and slave, not coach and athlete, not even teacher and student, but a relationship of friends, of children to loving parents. That's what the call of the good news is for you. I read a lovely story recently by an academic called Kamish Sankaran. He was raised an Indian Hindu, and he became a Christian in later life when he was an adult, when he came to realize that he couldn't reach God himself. He believed in God or many gods as a Hindu, but he talks about a friend who explained to him that Jesus died for his sins. He says this, it's a long quote, but go with me on this. How could my friend think that anyone, much less someone like me, he was very successful in lots of areas of life, was a sinner in need of salvation? Yes, I had problems, but wasn't I capable of fixing them myself? Why would I need Jesus to bear my sins? He goes on to talk about a Pharisee that really was offensive to him as someone with a background of religion that says you can fix your problems yourself, that you work for a better station in the next life. And that's your aim in life. He says the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector also blew the fuse of my understanding of God. How could a man who defrauded his own people, that's the tax collector, by conspiring with foreign occupiers have a better outcome before God than the religious leader, that's the Pharisee, who followed all the rules? This has exploded his understanding of God. He goes on to say, in a brief but decisive period, God exposed my false sense of self-sufficiency, which I had based on financial prosperity, academic success, and a strong relationship with my family. All things that lots of people think are important and how you judge whether you're living a good life or not. In short order, he says, I experienced unexpected and unexplainable failures in each of these areas: financial, academic, and relational. The blows came from different directions, but their cumulative effect was devastating. By removing the frail crutches on which my life was built, God exposed the reality of my profound weakness. You see, our religion is weak. Our good life, the life that we live, is going to be a failure and end in weakness and brokenness. We can't do this ourselves. But, says Jesus, we were made for an eternal destination. We were given a purpose in this life that is to love God and to love our neighbours. And the good news of the Christian message is that God has loved us with himself. Not just the way like you would want to love himself. He has loved us with himself. He has given his only son so that we could be free. So when we put these two passages together, we see that Jesus says that our life has both destination, that's heaven, and it has purpose, that's to love God and to love each other. There is an afterlife, an everlasting existence of such joy and happiness that 2 Corinthians 2:9 simply says, no eye has seen, no ear has heard what is in store for those who love him. To live a good life is actually to no longer think about how you're doing, but it's to depend on God, to realize what he's done, to realize how much he's given you, and then to respond with love yourself of him, with every bit of who you are, and to love your neighbour as yourself. And for those who do that, who trust in God, those who love him, as 2 Corinthians says, what awaits you is a heaven that is so good, so amazing, so beyond anything that the eye has seen or the ear has heard. And Jesus invites you and me to that.